No warnings, just karma.
My name is Margaret Parker, and 3 winters ago, a knock at my door cracked open a past I had spent years pretending no longer hurt. The man standing on my porch that evening wasn't a stranger, though time had carved such distance between us that he might as well have been. Snow clung to the shoulders of his tailored wool coat, melting into dark patches as he shifted his weight like someone unused to waiting outside. It was my brother James. He looked exactly as he always had, composed, controlled, successful in a way that made other people feel smaller without him ever raising his voice. "Dad's getting worse," he said, skipping hello. "We need you." Need. It was a word my family had never used for me before. Not when I left, not when I struggled, not when I built my life brick by lonely brick. If you've ever been the sibling who didn't fit the mold, the one whose dreams sounded irresponsible at the dinner table, the one quietly labeled potential wasted, then you know how loud that single word felt in my chest. Because this isn't just a story about money. It's about the day I stopped being the family's disappointment and became the one who rewrote the ending. I grew up in Cedar Springs, a town where lawns were trimmed, reputations mattered, and success had a very specific shape. I was the middle child, wedged between brilliance and beauty. James was the golden boy, Ivy League degree, corner office before 30. He wore achievement like a second skin. Stephanie, our youngest, was the darling. Effortlessly charming, socially perfect, later married into a wealthy family that measured worth in last names and charity galas. And then there was me, Margaret, the unpredictable one, the one who asked too many questions and trusted her instincts more than approval. I still remember the night I told my parents I wasn't going to college. We were sitting at the dinner table, roast chicken, green beans, the familiar clink of silverware. My heart pounded so loudly I barely heard my own voice. "I want to start businesses," I said. "I don't want to follow the traditional path." Silence fell like a curtain. My father didn't yell. He didn't argue. He just kept his eyes on his plate and said quietly, "You'll regret that decision for the rest of your life." Those words followed me for years. I left the next morning with $200, a duffel bag, and a determination they mistook for foolishness. In their version of my future, I was already a lesson in what not to do. What they never saw were the years that followed. The studio apartment with cracked windows and a heater that barely worked. The nights I fell asleep on my keyboard. The instant noodles. The panic when rent was due. The investors who smiled politely and said no. The friends I lost because I never had time. The days I cried in stairwells and then wiped my face and went back to work. But somewhere inside all that exhaustion, something real took root. I built a cybersecurity company focused on protecting small businesses, the ones too small for big corporate solutions, but too important to leave vulnerable. It started as an idea scribbled in a notebook at 2 a.m. It grew slowly, painfully, then suddenly. 8 years later, that impractical phase sold for $50 million. And my family never knew. To them, I was still scraping by, still stubborn, still figuring things out. When James offered to help with rent, I smiled and said thank you. When Stephanie gave me her old designer clothes or gift cards for interviews, I hugged her. I let them keep their version of me. Then Mom fell and broke her hip. Dad's memory, already fraying, began slipping faster. James called a family strategy meeting. His tone was efficient, clipped, already assigning roles. So I packed my oldest jeans and sweater, left my jet in its hangar, and flew commercial back to Cedar Springs. I made myself look like the version of me they were comfortable with. Walking into my childhood home felt like stepping into preserved air. The same photos on the walls, the same couch, the same smell of coffee and furniture polish. Dad looked smaller in his recliner. Mom moved too quickly on an injured leg, still trying to take care of everyone. Their love was real. But so was the pity. "Are you eating enough?" Mom asked softly, touching the sleeve of my worn sweater. That night, Stephanie arrived in pearls and perfume, shopping bags swinging from her wrists. Gifts came out like she was hosting a talk show giveaway. Scotch for Dad, silk scarf for Mom, leather portfolio for James. For me, a gift card. For interview clothes, she said kindly. I smiled. I always smiled. The next morning, James turned the living room into a corporate presentation. Slides projected on the wall. Charts, cost breakdowns for luxury assisted living. I'll cover 45%, he said. Stephanie and Andrew 40, that leaves 15%, around $1,200 a month for Margaret. Stephanie leaned in. If that's too much, dear, maybe you can contribute more time instead. And my firm has an entry-level position open, James added smoothly. Stability would be good for you. Then, almost under his breath, he muttered, You can't drift forever. That was the moment something inside me went still. I need to make a quick call, I said calmly. Outside, I dialed. Margaret, bring it in, 15 minutes, front lawn. When I came back, they continued discussing my limitations. Then the sound began. A low, rhythmic thrum that made the windows tremble. James walked to the window. Is that a helicopter landing on the lawn? I stood, my heart was steady. Yes, that's mine. Silence detonated in the room. I walked outside into the winter air as the black helicopter settled onto the grass. My family stood frozen in the doorway behind me. Snow swirled in sharp circles as the helicopter blades cut through the winter air, flattening the grass on the front lawn of the house where I had once learned to ride a bike, where I had once cried over math homework, where I had once been told my dreams were mistakes. The door behind me creaked open. I didn't turn right away, but I could feel them there, my entire family standing shoulder to shoulder in the doorway, stunned into silence. James was the first to find his voice. Margaret, what is this? I faced them calmly, the wind tugging at my hair. You said I couldn't even afford a car, I said evenly. You were right. I chose something a little more efficient. The pilot stepped out and gave me a polite nod. Waiting for instructions like this was any other pickup, not the moment my old life cracked in half. Stephanie's hand flew to her mouth. This is a joke, right? No, I said gently. It's just the truth catching up. Mom looked overwhelmed, one hand gripping the doorframe for balance. Dad squinted past the noise, confusion and awe mixing on his face. Margaret, he said slowly, what's going on? I walked back toward them, boots crunching in the thin layer of snow. For the first time in years, I wasn't shrinking under their eyes. I told you, I said softly. I started businesses, one of them worked. James let out a short, disbelieving laugh. A helicopter working. Yes. Silence swallowed his next question. I need you all to come with me, I continued. There are things we need to talk about properly, not like yesterday, not with assumptions. James hesitated. He hated not being the one in control of the room, but curiosity, and something that looked a lot like uncertainty, pushed him forward. The ride was quiet. Stephanie gripped Andrew's arm so tightly her knuckles turned white. Mom kept whispering, "Oh my goodness," under her breath. Dad stared out the window like a child seeing the world for the first time. James didn't speak at all. When the helicopter descended over my estate, the reaction was immediate. The lake, half frozen and shining under pale sunlight. The stone mansion standing solid and elegant against the winter trees. The gardens sleeping under frost. The helipad gleaming like it belonged in another world entirely. The helicopter touched down smoothly. No one moved at first. Margaret, Mom whispered, you live here. Yes, I said quietly. I built a life you never came to see. Inside, warmth wrapped around us. Marble floors. Tall windows framing the lake. Firelight already dancing in the main sitting room where Margaret, my assistant, waited discreetly with a tablet in hand. She gave me a small, grounding nod. I wasn't just a daughter here. I was the woman who ran this place. We sat. They didn't perch like judges anymore. They sank into the couches like people who had just realized they'd misunderstood an entire story. James cleared his throat. "Start talking." So I did. I told them about the early years, the failures I never shared, the nights I almost quit, the first breakthrough contract, the patents, the expansion, the acquisition offer that made my hands shake when I read it. "I sold the company 6 months ago," I said. "Just over 50 million. Stephanie blinked rapidly. Andrew's entire posture changed, less relaxed, more calculating. James just stared at me like he was trying to find the old version of his sister behind my face. Dad's eyes filled with tears. "You did all that alone." "I wasn't alone," I said softly. "I had a team, mentors, people who believed in me. I just never had that here." Mom started crying quietly. "We thought you were struggling. We thought offering help was kindness." "It was pity," I said gently. "And I let you believe it because I got tired of trying to prove myself to people who had already decided who I was." The words didn't come out angry. They came out honest. James leaned back, rubbing his jaw. "You should have told us." "I tried," I replied. "You just never really listened. You heard startup and translated it to phase." That landed. I nodded to Margaret, who placed a thick folder on the table. "There's something else," I said. They looked at the documents like they might explode. "I already arranged long-term care for Mom and Dad," I continued. "A private residence connected to a foundation I funded, top medical staff, memory care, physical therapy, everything." James blinked. "You what?" "It's done, paid for life." Mom covered her mouth again, but this time it wasn't shock. It was relief so deep it hurt to watch. Dad looked at me with a softness I hadn't seen since I was a little girl. "You took care of us," he whispered. "I wanted to," I said, "but I also needed to prove something to myself, that I could succeed without becoming bitter." The room fell into a different kind of silence. Not judgment. Recognition. Stephanie finally spoke, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. "I'm sorry, for the clothes, the gift cards. I thought I was being generous." "I know," I said, "but generosity without respect feels like charity. I never wanted your money. I wanted you to believe I was capable." James stood and walked toward the window, staring out at the lake. His reflection in the glass looked less like an executive and more like a brother who had missed years of his sister's life. "I built my identity on being the successful one," he said quietly. "It was easier to think you were drifting than to imagine you were building something I didn't understand." I didn't answer right away. "Success isn't a limited resource," I said finally. "There was room for all of us." When James turned back, the edge was gone from his expression. "I'm sorry, Margaret." Not polished, not strategic. Real. And for the first time since I was 18 years old, I believed my family was actually seeing me. Not the role they'd assigned, not the cautionary tale, but the woman I had fought to become. But this was only the beginning. Because respect spoken in a moment of shock is easy. Respect proven over time is something else entirely. The first night they stayed at the estate, nobody slept well. Not because the guest suites weren't comfortable. They were warmer and larger than any hotel my family had ever stayed in. But because the ground beneath our relationships had shifted, and none of us yet knew how to stand on it. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, watching moonlight ripple across it from the lake outside. For years, I had imagined this moment, the reveal, the shock, the apologies. I thought it would feel like victory. Instead, it felt like responsibility. The next morning, I asked everyone to meet me in the study after breakfast. James arrived first, already dressed like he had a board meeting, though his usual sharpness had softened. Stephanie came in quietly, no designer bag in hand this time, just a notebook. Mom and Dad followed slowly, Dad leaning a little heavier on his cane. On the desk were 4 folders. James noticed immediately. More surprises. "Not surprises," I said. "Structure." They sat. "I meant what I said yesterday," I began. I paid for Mom and Dad's care because I can, but that doesn't mean I'm carrying this alone emotionally or practically. James straightened slightly. Stephanie looked down at her hands. I slid the first folder toward James. Joint medical power of attorney, I said. You and I together, no solo decisions, ever. He opened it, scanning quickly. His instinct to lead flickered across his face, then faded. That's fair, he said quietly. I slid the second to Stephanie. You'll coordinate their weekly social schedule. Visits, outings when possible, family rotations, not gifts, time. Her eyes lifted slowly to mine. You don't trust me. I don't trust old patterns, I corrected gently. This helps us build new ones. She swallowed, then nodded. Okay. The third folder was for both of them. A care oversight clause, I continued. If either of you disappears when things get inconvenient, a third-party care manager steps in and family decision privileges get limited. This isn't punishment. It's protection for Mom and Dad. James leaned back, exhaling slowly. You really thought this through. I've had years of being underestimated, I said. It gives you a lot of time to plan. Dad chuckled softly at that. Mom squeezed my hand. And you, James asked, what's your role in all this? I'll handle the financial trust, facility coordination, and emergency decisions if you're unreachable. But more than that, I paused. I want to be their daughter again, not just the one who sends money. That landed in a place deeper than any legal clause. There was no argument, no defensiveness. Just quiet acceptance that the center of gravity in our family had shifted, not because I demanded control, but because I was finally willing to hold it. The transition to the care residence happened 2 weeks later. It sat beside a quiet lake, sunlight pouring through wide windows, nurses who spoke gently and never rushed. The foundation name on the building matched the one I had created years ago, back when success was still uncertain, but my intentions were clear. Mom cried when she saw her room not from sadness, but relief. Dad kept saying, "This is nice. This is very nice," like he needed to convince himself it was real. James handled the paperwork beside me without trying to take over. Stephanie brought framed family photos, carefully placing them around the room, asking Mom where she wanted each one. Small things, but real. Weeks passed. James started visiting on Wednesday evenings after work, still in his suit, but now sitting beside Dad and listening to the same stories repeated without correcting him. Stephanie came every Saturday with scrapbooks and old music Mom loved. No social media posts, no performance, just presence. One afternoon, I arrived unannounced and found James in the courtyard, slowly walking with Dad, matching his pace step for step. Not leading, not rushing. He looked up when he saw me, a little embarrassed. He wanted to walk, figured I should keep up. I smiled. You're doing good. So are you, he said. And for once, it didn't sound like comparison. It sounded like respect. That night, back at my estate, I stood on the terrace overlooking the dark water. The helicopter sat silent on the pad, the mansion lights glowing behind me, symbols of a life I had built from sheer will. But the real wealth wasn't behind those walls. It was in a quiet care home an hour away, where my parents were safe. My siblings were learning to show up, and the story of our family was no longer ruled by old roles. I had thought success would feel loud. Instead, it felt steady. Not a victory over them. A victory for all of us. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to prove I belonged. I simply knew I did. Spring came slowly that year. The ice on the lake outside my estate thinned day by day, cracking into drifting sheets that caught the sunlight like broken glass. Change, I'd learned, rarely happened all at once. It melted in layers. 3 months into my parents' move, the first real test came. The care director called me early one morning. Dad had wandered out of his wing at night, confused and agitated. He wasn't hurt, but his memory had taken another step backward. They recommended increasing his supervision level, which meant a change in care plan and cost. Old Margaret would have just said yes and handled it quietly. New Margaret called a family meeting. We gathered in a private room at the residence. James arrived straight from work. Stephanie came without makeup, hair pulled back, eyes worried. The doctor explained the options gently. More monitoring, specialized cognitive therapy, structured routines. James asked practical questions. Stephanie asked emotional ones. I watched them both, not taking over, not shrinking either. When the doctor finished, James turned to me automatically. "What do you think we should do?" Not because I had the money. Because I had the clarity. "We increase care," I said. "Comfort first, always." They both nodded, without hesitation. That was the moment I realized something had truly shifted. Leadership in our family no longer came from authority or tradition. It came from trust. A few weeks later, I walked into Mom's room and found Stephanie brushing her hair, slow and patient, listening to the same story about her high school dance for the third time without correcting a single detail. In the courtyard, James sat beside Dad with a photo album, letting him narrate memories out of order, never rushing him to be accurate. They weren't performing. They were present. That evening, the three of us sat together on a bench outside, while our parents napped inside. "I didn't understand what strength looked like before," Stephanie said quietly. "I thought it was looking perfect, marrying well, never struggling." James gave a small, humorless laugh. "I thought it was control, titles, promotions." They both looked at me. "I thought it was proving everyone wrong," I admitted. "Turns out it's staying kind after you could have chosen not to be." The air between us felt different now, not heavy with old competition, not sharp with comparison. Just honest. Summer brought longer days. We started having Sunday lunches together at the residence garden. Sometimes Dad was clear. Sometimes he was. Sometimes Mom laughed like nothing had changed. Sometimes she cried quietly when she thought no one noticed. We noticed. We stayed. One afternoon, Dad looked at me with surprising clarity and said, "You were never the mistake, you know. I was just afraid of a road I didn't understand." I squeezed his hand. "I know, Dad." And for the first time, I truly did. Later that night, back at my estate, I walked down to the dock alone. The water was calm, reflecting the sky in soft streaks of gold and blue. I thought about the girl who left this town with $200 and a duffel bag. The one who cried in stairwells and kept going anyway. The one who built something powerful not just in business, but in herself. Success had given me freedom. But forgiveness, theirs and mine, had given me peace. I no longer needed the helicopter to prove anything. I no longer needed the mansion to feel worthy. I had my family back. Not the old version built on roles and expectations, but a new one built on respect, accountability, and love that had finally grown up. The girl they underestimated had become the woman who held the family together. Not with force, not with money alone, but with boundaries strong enough to protect everyone, including herself. If you've ever been the one they doubted, the quiet builder, the late bloomer, don't rush your story. Let them misunderstand. Let them talk. Let them think you're behind. Keep building anyway. One day, the truth will stand so solid it won't need defending. And when that day comes, you won't just have success. You'll have self-respect, earned the hard way, and a life no one can ever shrink again. If this journey moved you, like the story and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more powerful stories about strength, justice, and rising beyond expectations. Months passed, but the transformation wasn't just theirs, it was mine too. The Margaret who had once felt invisible, who had learned to apologize for taking up space, now walked through life with a quiet certainty. Every decision, every boundary I set, reinforced the truth. I was no longer defined by the labels of my family or the town I had left behind. James, once the golden boy who measured worth in titles and promotions, began seeking my counsel on matters beyond money. "Margaret," he said one evening, reviewing the logistics of a charity gala I had funded. "I realize now, there's a perspective I've been blind to all these years." Stephanie, too, had shed her condescension. She spent hours with Mom, laughing, sharing old stories, and even asking advice on things she had previously dismissed as beneath her attention. One afternoon, she admitted quietly, "I thought I had all the answers. I didn't even see what was in front of me." Mom and Dad flourished in the care facility. Dad's memory still wavered, but the peace on his face, something I had never seen during the years of tension, was worth every confrontation, every legal clause, every silent fight I had endured to get here. Mom's health stabilized, and her spirit soared now that she felt seen and supported rather than being a burden I had to manage. One evening, I stood on the terrace of my estate, watching the sunset cast its golden light over the lake. My parents were inside, playing cards with Stephanie and James. Their laughter carried across the water. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. I remembered the days of struggle, the failures that had burned me down to nothing, and I realized all of it had been necessary. The hunger, the loneliness, the nights I almost gave up, it had built a foundation stronger than wealth, stronger than fear, stronger than judgment. I thought back to the helicopter, the mansion, the $1 million company. Those were the symbols of my success, but the real victory was intangible. It was respect. It was accountability. It was love that had been earned, not given out of pity or expectation. James approached quietly and handed me 2 glasses of whiskey. He raised his glass toward the horizon. "To family," he said. "Not perfect, but ours." I clinked my glass against his, smiling. "To truth," I said softly, "and to the courage to live it." That night, lying in bed, I didn't feel the weight of proving myself anymore. The family that had once defined me by their expectations now recognized me for who I was: strong, capable, unyielding when it mattered, yet tender where it counted. The estate was quiet. The lake reflected the stars. The helicopter rested in its hangar. And for the first time, I realized that success wasn't in the noise of achievements. It was in the silence of understanding, in the respect that had been hard-won, in the boundaries that protected love instead of suffocating it. Margaret Parker, the girl they underestimated, had become the woman they could no longer ignore. And this time, the story was mine entirely. The past had shaped me, but it no longer controlled me. The family that once doubted, belittled, and underestimated me now stood beside me. Not above, not below, but equal, facing the future together, grounded in respect, accountability, and a love that had been tested and proven. Winter returned again, but it felt different this time. Not harsh, not cold, but crisp and clear, like the air of a new beginning. The estate, once a symbol of my silent triumph, now felt like a home, alive with subtle laughter and the rhythm of a family finding balance. The real test came subtly, as all profound moments do, not with a dramatic announcement, but with quiet, persistent challenges. Dad's memory would falter unpredictably, Mom would have an off day, and James and Stephanie would occasionally fall back into old patterns of judgment or overreach. But I had changed, and so had they. One evening, Dad misplaced his medication. Mom panicked, flustered. James began to instruct, his tone tinged with that old executive sharpness. Stephanie stepped in, trying to overcorrect Mom's worry. I stepped forward, calm, deliberate. "Stop," I said gently. "We follow the system. No arguments, no blame. Margaret, could you verify the schedule?" Within moments, the chaos dissolved. Mom exhaled. Dad chuckled nervously. James and Stephanie exchanged a glance, realizing the difference between control and guidance. I wasn't taking over, I was orchestrating balance. It was then I understood the final lesson of this journey. Authority without compassion is tyranny. Compassion without boundaries is chaos. True strength comes when both coexist. Months turned into seasons. Our family dinners became traditions of presence rather than performance. No judgments, no unspoken competitions, just honesty and accountability. One autumn evening, the 4 of us, James, Stephanie, Mom, and Dad, sat on the terrace overlooking the lake. Leaves tumbled across the lawn, golden and red, drifting into the water like fragments of the past being carried away. James lifted his glass. "To Margaret," he said. "Not the sister we thought we knew, but the one we finally understand." Stephanie added, "To the patience we lacked and the lessons we've learned." Mom and Dad nodded, their hands intertwined. "To family," they said together, eyes misted, smiles genuine. I held my glass high, letting the moment settle like sunlight. "To truth," I whispered, "and to the courage to stand in it." It was the first time in years that I felt no tension, no resentment, no doubt. The air between us was calm, strong, and warm. Margaret Parker, the once overlooked middle child, had finally rewritten the story, not through spectacle, not through money alone, but through steadfast persistence, integrity, and love forged in fire. And in that clarity, I realized something profound. The wealth that matters isn't measured in currency, mansions, or luxury helicopters. It's measured in respect earned, trust rebuilt, and the courage to define your own worth unapologetically. For the first time, I was free, not just from the expectations of my family, but from the fear of being unseen, unheard, and underestimated. We were still a family of flaws and quirks, of stubbornness and mistakes, but we were real. We were present, and we were finally whole. Winter melted into spring, and the world outside my estate bloomed, but inside, something deeper had taken root. Years of tension, judgment, and silent competition had transformed into understanding, respect, and a shared commitment to one another. The family that once doubted, dismissed, and underestimated me now moved forward as partners in life, not adversaries. One morning, I watched from my terrace as Dad and James walked along the lake's edge, hats in hand, talking quietly. Dad's steps were slower now, but James matched his pace, listening instead of instructing. Stephanie helped Mom tend to the small garden near the residence, laughing at a story Mom told for the 100th time, not correcting, not rushing, just present. I realized then that the true measure of victory wasn't the helicopter, the mansion, or the millions. It was in moments like this, simple, quiet, steady proof that respect had replaced judgment, presence had replaced neglect, and love had replaced competition. I called Margaret, my steadfast assistant and confidant, to review the final arrangements for the Westbrook Foundation. Every detail of my parents' care, every document, every financial safeguard had been set. This wasn't charity. It was justice. Justice for years of underestimation, for silent doubts, for the moments when my family had failed to see me, not the girl who stumbled, but the woman who endured. James approached me on the terrace, holding 2 glasses of whiskey. "You've done more than I could have imagined," he said, his voice quieter, tempered with genuine awe. "Not just for Mom and Dad, but for all of us, for the family we've finally become." I smiled, taking the glass. "It wasn't about showing off," I said. "It was about showing up. Sometimes the hardest part isn't winning, it's proving that you can be trusted with truth, with responsibility, with care." We clinked glasses. "To truth," I said, "and to courage." Stephanie joined us, brushing the wind from her hair, her expression softer, eyes glistening. "To family," she said. "Not perfect, but ours." Dad and Mom appeared at the doorway, holding hands. "To love," they said together, and in their voices was the acknowledgement of all the years lost and all the years regained. I looked out over the lake, the sun dipping low, the sky painted in golds and purples. I breathed deeply. For the first time, I felt entirely free. Free from doubt, free from judgment, free from the roles I had been forced into and the expectations I had been expected to meet. Margaret Parker, once the overlooked middle child, had stepped fully into her power, not to dominate but to restore, not to punish but to protect, not to boast but to lead with strength, clarity, and compassion. This was the life I had fought for. This was the family I had reclaimed. And this was the moment where the story, finally, was whole. If Margaret's journey inspired you, if her courage reminded you of your own strength, like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories that empower, uplift, and prove that perseverance and truth always prevail.